Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Anthony. I work in Congressman Blumenauer's district office here in Portland. I'm so excited to be here today moderating our virtual town hall. First on tonight's agenda, we'll hear some opening remarks from Congressman Blumenauer before moving on to a question and answer session. So far, we've received hundreds of questions and hopefully the Congressman can touch on as many topics as the hour allows. Throughout the town hall, attendees can continue to submit questions and comments using the chat feature on YouTube. With that being said, I'll turn it over to the Congressman for opening remarks.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited to have the conversation today for a couple of reasons. One, the child tax credit that we've been working on, sort of Social Security for kids. Checks are now arriving today that are going to go to every to 100 to 100 to 83% of the children in the city, to the district, 137,000. And it's going to lift over 10,000 children out of poverty. This is amazing. And these checks that arrive today and in people's bank accounts will continue for 6 months. It's an amazing opportunity for us to be able to raise nationally almost half of children out of poverty. And we're working to try and make this adjustment permanent. Another thing that I'm really excited about is that we have heard the report of what's the negotiations for the reconciliation project with the Senate. The reconciliation process is a mechanism that allows us to avoid the Senate filibuster. Anything that all the Democrats and Vice President Harris agree on, and we can get through the House, is enacted into law. It's not something that Republicans can tie in knots. And this opens the way for a $3.5 trillion package, potentially. The framework is established. We'll maybe touch a little bit more on that, but this is itself extraordinarily significant. It's an opportunity for us to take the next wave of major efforts that's possible with the Biden administration and Democrats in control in the Senate. That is transformative. We still have a margin in the House. It's not very great, but there's a path forward for more transformational activities. But with that, let's turn, Anthony, to hear what's on people's minds in the district. I'll try and provide shorter answers. Part of the problem is I get carried away with some of these, more detail maybe than is necessary. And I'd like to be able to deal with as many questions that people have in the time we have available.
And there are plenty of questions. Thank you, Congressman. And that was a great preview of the different topics we're going to hear about tonight. So let's just jump right into the Q&A portion. So our first question is actually about infrastructure. How are communities of color being prioritized in this infrastructure bill? And this question is from Sheila.
Well, thank you, Sheila. The infrastructure bill that passed in the House of Representatives focuses on opportunities to be able to remedy some of the past actions that have inflicted damage on low-income communities of color. That's where they located the freeways. That's where there have been other infrastructure projects that put the negative consequences on people who just were powerless to oppose them. One of the things that's been worked on here in Portland, the Albina Vision process, which would heal some of the scars that were left by the redevelopment, by the I-5 freeway. Community's been working, and there are $20 billion that the president has called for resources to deal with these challenges. There will also be prioritization in terms of new projects going forward that meet those criteria. Chairman DeFazio, our own Peter DeFazio, who heads the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, is committed to equity and a low carbon transportation future.
Thanks, Congressman. Okay, so moving into the soft infrastructure, right? Caitlin asks, would love to hear you talk about human care infrastructure, meaning child care, paid leave.
Well, that's the second part of the president's plan. The hard infrastructure, rebuilding and renewing America, dealing with everything from broadband to getting rid of hundreds of thousands of lead pipes that are literally poisoning our children as they drink tap water at the drinking fountain in school. The other piece that's been talked about would universalize pre-care, have family leave. The United States is the only country that doesn't have, developed country doesn't have paid family leave. Dealing with opportunities for expanding funds for caregivers. This is every bit as important as what we do with the physical infrastructure. And one of the things we have seen in the pandemic is that what holds our community together and the people who make it possible are every bit as essential as roads, bridges, and other essential workers. People who work in providing healthcare, providing childcare, as well as people who deliver groceries. The commitment of the Biden administration is to deal with the other part of that infrastructure package, that human infrastructure, and making it a priority. We've already moved in the House of Representatives on some of these items earlier, and we're going to work hard with the reconciliation package to make them permanent and funded.
With all of those programs, there comes a price tag, and we have a YouTube chat question. With the talk of infrastructure, how much debt is being passed to our kids, and at what point do you stop and say enough is enough?
Well, I think it's important to be careful about how we deal with the fiscal situation. No question about it. For example, what's being negotiated now with the Senate is all paid for in terms of inheritance tax, in terms of higher corporate tax, in terms of the interesting concept of helping rich people remember to declare all their income. The top 1% fails to declare over 20% of their income. And if it's the top 0.1%, that percentage that they forget to include in their tax returns doubles. There's an effort here to have greater enforcement for the IRS to be able to collect taxes that are already due. But the commitment here is to make sure that nobody who earns under $400,000 a year would have his or her taxes increased. Now, there will be some debt involved, but we're talking about a package that is going to provide benefits for generations to come. And so some of this, it doesn't bother me if my grandchildren are going to help pay for it. But this is a balanced effort, working to pay for it, working to provide greater opportunities for families, and candidly, it will help improve the productivity of the economy if we deal with things like paid family leave, more childcare, more access to community colleges. That makes us more productive. It reduces the burden on families and students, and makes us all better off. But make no mistake, it is important to be careful about what we're doing going forward. Now, I will say that this distinguishes us from what the Republicans did. The Republicans piled on hundreds of billions of dollars of debt with their tax cuts for people who basically didn't need it, and paid for none of it. It was all added to the national debt. That's not what we're doing here.
Thank you, Congressman. The next question is from Emily. Emily asked, what are we doing in Oregon to keep communities cool and have access to air conditioning during extreme heat? Our recent heat wave is a good reminder that 1 in 5 residents in Portland do not have AC. Will AC be considered infrastructure?
That is a great question, and it's one that until very recently, I don't think people have really dealt with in the way that they should. But it is not a new issue in terms of meeting basic human needs. Our former governor, John Kitzhaber, is fond of pointing out that one of the ways that you can save tens of thousands of dollars of healthcare expense is simply providing an air conditioner for somebody with congestive heart failure. Having an opportunity for healthcare systems to write a prescription for an air conditioner actually will save us all money in the long run. I think looking more strategically about how we have access to cooling stations. This is something in terms of how we deal with changing climate, changing building standards, and expectations about how we use our public spaces is something that I think needs more investment and attention and coordination. Because what we just saw 2 weeks ago is sort of a preview of coming attractions. And it's going to be something we're going to have to deal with moving forward. And Portland has the third least air conditioning infrastructure of residents in the country. Seattle evidently is the worst, but it's something that we're going to have to continue to make sure that the government plays its role. One of the specific things that I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to do deals with more air conditioning for public housing. This is something that should be part of the infrastructure for the federal investment for housing. And it's long overdue to be able to provide more air conditioning for residents of our public housing.
And looks like the next question is also about the severe weather. Anna asked, I'd like to know your thoughts on federal standards for protecting agricultural workers as we experience more severe weather and wildfires.
Yeah, we had, sadly, an agricultural worker amongst the people who died here in Oregon. And candidly, agricultural workers have been shortchanged for generations by federal policy. They were excluded from Social Security or from worker standards in terms of fair labor standards. This is, I think, outrageous and unconscionable. I'm hopeful that this is an area that we'll be able to make more progress. It's something that we're committed to in terms of a comprehensive effort, long overdue. It is an area that is deeply troubling because it reflects this discrimination that we've seen. The same thing with Social Security was denied to agricultural workers as well as domestics as part of the price they paid with the southern congressional barons.
And with that being said, Andrew wants to know how you will ensure we leverage the infrastructure and budget bills to save our future. And kind of in the same vein, what opportunities do you see for moving climate legislation through Congress?
Well, part of what I'm really proud of what the House did with the transportation infrastructure package is that it is a commitment to a low carbon future. Everything from building materials to the transportation modes in terms of bike, pedestrian, transit, increasing those investments. It is the number one source of our greenhouse gas emissions is the transportation sector. There is an aggressive program of electrification, more electric buses, electric vehicles, charging stations, electric bikes, scooters, all are part of this effort. And I am pleased that we were able to get a number of those provisions that I've been working on, my legislation, in that package. And it will make a big difference in terms of future efforts of a low carbon future. But even things like low carbon cement. Cement is a huge generator of carbon, and that's one of the things that would be required in terms of that new transportation bill.
Yeah, we have a number of questions about the climate crisis. But before we shift to those questions, I want to ask you one more question that came in from Tom on the YouTube chat. Why isn't I-5 being addressed in the infrastructure plan?
Well, I'm not certain I fully understand what Tom is talking about. There's an opportunity with the resources that we have in this bill to be able to focus on areas where there are major project investments. There's going to be an unprecedented amount of money that goes to the state of Oregon where they can allocate on priority projects that are important. There's an opportunity, if we get our act together, for money that would help with a I-5 crossing, categories there, and opportunities to deal with orphan highways. I was really excited the progress that we made with in this last session of the legislature to agree to transfer Division Street from state ownership to the city ownership with enough money to bring it up to standard. And we're working to be able to provide resources for these so-called orphan highways that have sort of not kept up with the times, to be able to have federal resources there as well. There's significant amounts of undesignated resources in broad categories that the state of Oregon will be able to use for projects like dealing with our interstate system.
Thank you, Congressman. And we have one question, one that got brought up here. What opportunities why do you align yourself with the anti-American so-called squad? Why do you support killing our economy with higher taxes and higher energy costs? Ultimately, the increase in energy costs hurts poor and middle-class people a lot. How can you say that you represent them?
Well, I politely disagree with their characterizations of my colleagues. These are terrific members of Congress. We've had, in fact, we've had town meetings with AOC and Ayanna Pressley that people can go online and witness for themselves. These articulate, thoughtful, constructive members of Congress that I'm pleased to work with. We also had a town meeting here with Congresswoman Tlaib from Detroit when we dealt with the housing crisis. Level-headed, thoughtful, hardworking, and effective. We're not going to be able to move forward to protect our future without changing the equation dealing with energy. In fact, what we've been working on over the years has actually reduced the cost of producing energy. It's not job killing. There are far more jobs involved with renewable energy, for instance, than the oil and gas industry or coal. It's why the coal is in decline. It's not only is it a fuel source from the past, but it doesn't compete economically. We've driven down the price of solar and wind so that it is actually cheaper than building new fossil fuel infrastructure. That's where the jobs for the future are. And they are not making the climate crisis worse. I mean, we have just seen an example of what's happened with rampant carbon pollution. The experts agree what happened here 2 weeks ago was not some random act. It was unprecedented, and undoubtedly climate change made it much worse and more likely to occur in the future. That's the threat to the economy. That's the threat to our society. And it's hardly Marxist policies. I would note, last but not least, that the administration has been working with antitrust provisions because our economy is not working as the way that it would design. There are monopolistic forces. Some of the big platforms, for example, we have examples where Amazon is undercutting people who use that service, copying their products and poaching on their customers. We need to have antitrust enforcement. That's not communistic. Having childcare, like virtually every other industrialized country has, is not communistic. That enables people to work, to thrive, start their own business, take care of their own family in a way that is more balanced and forgiving. I think these are the directions that our country needs to go. I'm proud to be involved with them, and I think the results are pretty powerful.
Thank you, Congressman. And we have Betsy in the YouTube chat. She asked, with climate change increasing challenges for salmon runs already on the brink of extinction, how do you plan to use the infrastructure bill to invest in new energy and remove the Snake River dams?
Well, first and foremost, there isn't anything that is developed at this point that is legislation removing the Snake River dams. I've been working with my friend, Congressman Mike Simpson from Idaho, to be able to raise these issues and prepare for a future for the Columbia River Basin that speaks to trying to save the salmon, try and be more mindful of how we deal with the water resources. But there isn't anything in the infrastructure package that speaks to that directly. It's already passed, and the work is not there in terms of legislation that would make it possible. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can't do. Dealing with the future of the Columbia River Basin, what we're doing with the treaty with Canada to be more ecologically sound, working in terms of habitat restoration, dam removal that is slated for the Klamath. That's looks like it's funded and ready to go. That would make a huge difference for salmon runs. In the meantime, being able to work with the tribes, with Congressman Simpson and other interested groups to be able to look at the future so that when there is an opportunity that we can take advantage of it. But that's not the case now. It isn't ripe. There isn't legislation. We need to continue to refine these approach. Part of the problem, candidly, is there is an agreement about the removal of the Snake River dams, including people here in the Northwest who are Democrats. There's a division of opinion about what should happen and how it should happen. That's why I'm pleased to work with Mike to be able to provide more public involvement, more discussion, more debate, and to try and refine approaches going forward. But we don't have the consensus now or the proposal that would allow us to do so.
And we can do an entire town hall on climate. But we did have a number of questions about the political process, so I'll jump into some of these now. The first one comes from Jeffrey, who asked, the For the People Act appears to be stalled. Please comment on how we can get this passed.
Yeah, there's some real fierce headwinds in the Senate. One of the major priorities of Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, is to continue to block this legislation going forward, which, as you know, under the rules of the Senate, requires 60 affirmative votes to move it forward. There are a number of things that we're examining. First and foremost, there are efforts to try and have a carve out to the rules of the filibuster so that it wouldn't apply to things that deal with voting rights. This is a very narrow, specific effort. There's been some interest in trying to advance that. Also, Senator Manchin, who is a defender of the filibuster and is one of the people who would have to go along with the change, has indicated that he's open to modifying how the filibuster works. Right now, as you know, a person doesn't have to go all Jimmy Stewart, where he's on the floor for hours and hours and hours, holding the debate. That doesn't work that way. Right now, people can stop legislation just by saying they're not for it. They don't have to be there actually making the case. And so going back to the traditional vision of the filibuster, where you actually had to be there on the floor talking, going all Jimmy Stewart, as I say, would be another way to make that modification. But there are a wide range of activities going on right now to try and protect voting rights. First of all, you got to admire the courage and commitment of those Texas state legislators that left the state, denying the majority in Texas the ability to ram through their anti-democratic proposals. They took a stand for democracy, and I think it's, at least for the time being, it's successful. There are efforts underway challenging legally some these draconian things that are taking place around the country. It's not going to be easy, but we have an unprecedented legal team that's working on it. Last but not least, people are organizing themselves, pushing, fighting back, both politically and in the court of public opinion, getting business people to resist these efforts. This is a full court press to try and defend the democracy. We're not yet done in terms of what happens legislatively. We'll continue working on that, continue raising the profile, looking at Senate rules, but fighting this trench warfare to protect democracy. The final point I would just say is that it's very important to recognize that it isn't just expansion of the Voting Rights Act. That's important, but we already in many areas have more tools available than has been available in the past. Here in Oregon, we have every voter registration mechanism, motor voter, vote by mail, and unfortunately, we have tens of thousands of people in Oregon that aren't registered. We only had 82% of the people that bothered to vote last time. So there's a lot of work that we all can do protecting democracy by making sure that we register, even though it's harder, that we move to take advantage of the registration that we have and make sure that people vote. That still is a huge deficit. We've got a lot of work to do, and that could be transformational. Donald Trump was elected by people who didn't vote.
Well said. And we have a number of questions about foreign affairs, so we're going to shift in that direction. A few on YouTube are about Cuba specifically. Ricardo says, how can you in Congress support the Cuban people marching in the streets? And Abel says, Cubans of Portland would appreciate a few words in solidarity with the Cuban people who are in the streets asking for their freedom right now.
Indeed, and it is an exciting prospect. I have maintained throughout my political career that the embargo we have against Cuba is misguided and misdirected. I'm convinced that if we had normal relations with Cuba, Castro would have been a relic of history long ago. We kept him alive inappropriately. We had been trading and traveling and interacting with the Cuban people. I think the change would have occurred. I had to sneak into Cuba, well, not sneak, but I had to get into Cuba indirectly as part of my college alumni association at Lewis and Clark. Had a fabulous week interacting with the Cuban people in terms of the cultural activities, in terms of their vibrant, the food, farming, environment. It was a delightful experience. And it's clear that they have an affinity for the American people, despite the fact that we have, for over a century, the United States has not been a good neighbor. We've interfered with their efforts. The embargo was, I think, unnecessarily burdensome on them and had negative consequences. But my experience with the Cuban people has been one that's very positive, and I think we can build on this. I'm hopeful that we can nurture the seeds of self-expression and democracy, and the United States needs to stand with them. We've had a local, in Congress, we had a development that I'm very pleased with. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee has come out in favor of eliminating the embargo. And in the past, Republicans and Democrats alike on that key committee have committed to continuing it. And now we're seeing the winds of change in Congress, which I think is extraordinarily encouraging. Long overdue.
And we have a YouTube comment. This is something you've been working on, Congressman. The commenter says, we need help. We need to help Afghans get safely to Guam.
Yes, I agree. And this is an area that I'm pleased to have provided leadership for over a decade. It started for me working with students at Lincoln High School in Portland and a young National Guard lieutenant who were working to bring his translator to safety in Portland. And it led to legislation that I authored with the late John McCain and Teddy Kennedy, the first special immigrant visas for Afghans and Iraqis as well. We're fighting to increase the access to the visas, but we've been clear in Congress, we've got a great group of people who are working on it, that it's important for the administration to get these people out of harm's way. A friend of mine wrote a book, To Be a Friend is Fatal. Kirk Johnson, who dedicated years to helping make sure that these folks weren't victims because they were friends of the United States. We have now the administration committing to remove them. And I don't care if it's Guam or we bring them back here, we have an obligation to make sure that because they were our friend is not fatal for them and for their families. I've had too many examples of people who've had relatives kidnapped, people killed, tortured. The Taliban and other folks in both Afghanistan and Iraq have long memories, and the United States has an obligation to protect them. I'm pleased that we're making some progress. I hope that we're able to move quickly with the situation in Afghanistan, and it looks like the administration has agreed to us.
And another question from YouTube. Kathleen asked, I'm wondering if we are sending our surplus COVID vaccines overseas.
We've done some, but I think there's far more that needs to happen. I've been working, leading the charge, chairing the trade subcommittee in Congress to make sure that we are a better partner in terms of the intellectual property in the vaccines. We're working hard to get the TRIPS waiver that would enable that to happen in terms of providing access to those vaccines for developing countries. I'm pleased that we've been working with the administration, the U.S. Trade Representative, Kathleen Tai, who used to be our staff director on Ways and Means, has advanced the notion that the United States will support the TRIPS waiver. This will enable vaccines to be developed similar to what we did with HIV/AIDS. The United States has made some commitments to the global vaccine distribution, but I'm hopeful that we will, both with the TRIPS waiver and being able to distribute surplus vaccines, that we can make more of an impact. It's frustrating that in some parts of the country, they have more vaccines than they know what to do with. And sadly, there are still some people who are resisting sadly, in some of these red states to their peril. And we're seeing the evidence of that with increased infections.
And now we're going to shift to housing. We have a number of questions and comments about housing. One constituent on YouTube wants to know, homelessness is a national crisis. What is Congress doing about it?
It is indeed a national crisis. In fact, this is a project I worked on, a blueprint for what Congress should do getting back into the housing game. And I'm pleased that a number of the recommendations that we developed, that we put into legislative form, have been realized. For example, the prohibition of the federal government building new public housing has been lifted. There's more investment in public housing as a result of the budgeting that we're working on. Being able to have programs that deal with people who have been disadvantaged. The federal government discriminated against people of color, especially Black Americans, in terms of where they could live. It didn't enforce fair housing. It designed programs deliberately to exclude people of color. The redlining, this was official government policy. And sadly, we have not fully embraced free, fair, open, non-discriminatory housing. It's a project that I feel strongly about. We're putting some more money in terms of enforcement, but we've got our work cut out for us. Sadly, this is part of our legacy here in Oregon. We just this week celebrated the 100th, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Senator Mark Hatfield, who, as a young state representative, led fair housing legislation in Oregon back in 1953, but we still have a long way to go.
And you touched on some of this discrimination facing Black Americans. Relatedly, Carl on YouTube has asked, why do you think the House can't pass H.R. 40, a reparations bill brought forward by Rep. James Clyburn? Carl notes that you and two other members of the Oregon delegation are co-sponsors.
Well, I think we're starting to see a recognition that reparations, particularly as it relates to housing, is absolutely justified and long overdue. As I mentioned, it was federal policy that denied housing, the same housing opportunities that other Americans had, to Black and other people of color, and the indigenous situation is outrageous. One of the quickest ways to deal with reparations is to provide housing opportunities for those who were denied it in the past. And it's a very clear relationship in terms of the reason that we have the disparity in wealth in this country is the fact that people of color were denied these housing opportunities. Home ownership is the quickest path to wealth accumulation. And to see such disparities in terms of home ownership and wealth is directly tied to home ownership. A Black serviceman returning to Portland after World War II couldn't buy a home in Laurelhurst. Well, I think having programs to deal with populations that were actively discriminated against, to help them get access to housing, or in some cases, cash opportunities to payments, makes a great deal of sense. As I say, it's overdue. I think we can document in terms of what appropriate values would be, particularly given how egregious some of the behaviors were and have continued. It's not something that was, I mentioned the World War II veteran couldn't move into Laurelhurst, but we have a problem today where people of color pay higher property taxes on similar houses. Just in terms of how the property tax system works and what happens in terms of reassessment. And for people who for years were limited about where they could live, they paid more for inferior housing. And that continues in terms of the tax consequences. So it's not a simple equation to unravel. But I think having programs that deal with this direct disparity, have programs to help people get in housing, support them, be able to purchase housing, more opportunities for housing vouchers. All of these are part of this very important correction. Housing is essential to quality of life. Housing is a determinant for educational attainment. And we need to have a full court press to deal with it. And this housing report that I mentioned is available on my website that has a variety of things that we're working on that might be of interest.
And there are a number of questions also about COVID relief, and especially for restaurants. Ken asked, will there be additional funding for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund?
Well, we're certainly working on it. This was an area that was a huge priority for me for more than a year, and I'm proud to have worked with the leadership of the independent restaurants here in Oregon. The Independent Restaurant Coalition worked with me in designing a bill specifically to help rescue restaurants. We were able to successfully pilot that through Congress. We have $28.6 billion that's distributed. There's a list available now where hundreds and hundreds of Oregon restaurants got millions and millions of dollars. But the money was gone in less than a week. We've got a number of folks in line who deserve it, who need it. We've got to protect the integrity of not just the individual restaurants. It represents $1 trillion of a supply chain that goes from the farm to people that supply linens. And it's a workforce that has suffered mightily in the pandemic. We have over 190 co-sponsors of my bill that would replenish the restaurant fund with $50 billion, which would enable us to deal with everybody who's in line. And then working forward in terms of dealing with those supply chain issues, dealing with workforce issues. This is a vital part of our community, and candidly, every community across the country that I work with. People take pride in the corner diner or the fine restaurant or the food carts. These are often the first jobs for young people. It's disproportionately important for immigrants when they come for employment or to start those jobs and start their own business. That's why we designed it to be able to put emphasis on women, minorities, veterans, immigrants. We had some rich people file a suit claiming they were being discriminated against before we were able to fully activate it. But we were able to set aside $5 billion for small restaurants, particularly to help them. I'm pleased with the start, but we're not done. There's a lot more that we need to do, and we're working hard on this legislation.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I think we'll turn to Ari, who'd like to know what is being done to push President Biden for at least $10,000, if not $50,000 of student loan forgiveness.
This has been a steady drumbeat. It's a priority for Democrats in the House of Representatives, Elizabeth Warren in the Senate, and the administration, I know, is working on loan forgiveness. I sincerely hope that it's a minimum of 10,000, but that it's higher. The debt burden that we see on young Oregon graduates approaches $30,000. Being able to make a significant reduction in that student debt will free them economically to get on with their life. And it's more important now than ever when we deal with the consequences of the COVID crisis and how that has set them back in terms of family, career, and education. But there are other things we need to do in this space as well. It is outrageous what has happened with private for-profit colleges that have cheated so many young Oregonians and people around the country with I won't even call it degrees, certificates, things in some cases that aren't even worth the paper they're printed on, and use up their eligibility for college loans. The abuses that have taken place for veterans. We've got a number of things that in this area that need attention, but I hope we start with getting a significant loan forgiveness. And I'm confident we're going to see a proposal come forward with the Biden administration. And it's can't happen soon enough.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you to everyone for joining and submitting your questions on the YouTube and for being a part of this conversation. Congressman, do you have any final words?
Well, I really appreciate people taking this nice summer afternoon to be involved with this conversation. I appreciate all of the questions that have been submitted. We'll post some things on our in response to some of them we couldn't get to. But look forward to continuing these conversations. I hope that people will focus for the time being now on being able to take advantage of this child tax credit. It's transformational. We're working to try and make it permanent. And I hope people will add their voices to show what difference it makes and how making this permanent will transform the lives of children in Oregon and around the country. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next conversation.